You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Buick. News, views and interviews in association with FE News. Good evening. Welcome to Skills World Live. If you've been basking in the heat of the UK today, welcome to another scorcher. I hope you've got that after sun cream in the fridge. Such is the delights of Costerdale, Sussex these days. I've moved my fab day job office out onto part of my home's patio, which I'm calling proper alfresco work style. And if you thought only mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday sun, then spare a thought for the town of Porthmad Dog in Carnarvonshire, North Wales. They recorded Britain's highest temperature today of 27.6 degrees, or 81 degrees Fahrenheit for our wonderful American listeners. For the sunniest place in the United Kingdom today, a big shout out goes to the tiny village of Waddington in Lincolnshire, with nearly 16 hours of uninterrupted, pandemic adjusted UV rays. Talking of uninterrupted, stand by for another glorious 60 minutes of topical debate as this part-time, voluntary community radio DJ continues to help connect the world of FE. That's right, folks. Just 4 more of these daily evening live shows before we move to the new weekly live format next Thursday. Indeed, the working week is not even over yet, and already the show's editor, Gavin O'Mara, is phoning me up, sounding like an excited head of the scout troop, telling me all about his editorial plans. And here was me thinking I'd get a promotion to local hospital radio, and I'll be able to once again focus solely on my day job of representing qualifications and skills. But it seems from the emails, folks, you've been sending to skillsworld at fenews.co.uk that you're not ready to kill off the show, or indeed the lead character, quite yet. It appears the delight of all those uplifting house tunes during your Omara-inspired hashtag FE workout and the quality of our phone chat guests is just too good a thing to miss. You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Buick. On tonight's show, we're entering the realm of education and training inspection regimes. We had wanted to put Ofsted in the title, but such are the heated passions raised by that 6-letter acronym that we played it safe and went for the generic moniker of inspection instead. Still, it wasn't enough to persuade someone from Ofsted to come on the programme this evening, even though we made the request. Inspections have been temporarily suspended due to COVID-19, so one would have thought perhaps they had a bit more time on their hands. No matter, we still have a great lineup of guests this evening to discuss whether we need to change the inspection regime for providers. That's schools, colleges, and ITPs. After the news, I'll be talking to tonight's special guest, the former Skills Minister, Right Honourable Anne Milton, who you may recall resigned from the government over Brexit and fought the last general election in December as an independent. In the middle segment of the show, I'll be joined by Chris Jones, who was previously the FE and Apprenticeship Specialist at Ofsted, and Karen Westpeaser, who describes herself on Twitter, and I quote, as an education evidence geek. Oh, we like those on this show. And above all, stay tuned for the last part of the programme, when I'll be catching up with the boss of the 100-year-old Institute of the Motor Industry, Steve Nash. Indeed, I seem to recall one of my last physical engagements just before lockdown, being invited to the IMI's swanky Mayfair Centenary Celebration dinner, hosted by the 77-year-old Prince Michael of Kent. But first, without further ado, let's find out what's been making the news headlines in your skills world this evening. The Department for Education have published details on how the government will put in place student number controls for the 2020-21 academic year in England. Number controls will only apply to full-time undergraduate UK/EU domiciled students, with certain specified exemptions. For example, the control will not apply to students sitting their A-levels in the autumn and new providers. Universities Minister Michelle Donnellan said she acknowledged it was an extremely difficult and anxious time for students, universities and their staff, and that this was one of the reasons why the government was introducing student number controls, to stabilise the university admission system and to protect the HE sector from the financial impact of COVID-19, she said. In other news, the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education, IFE, has launched an online survey to find out what impact COVID-19 is having on the skills sector. Apprentice employers are being asked to forecast how their recruitment over the summer will compare to the same time last year, as well as to highlight any issues that the IFE should be taking on board. The research comes at a time when starts for new apprentices have plummeted further during the pandemic. Provisional data released last week found that just 7,000 apprentices started an apprenticeship in April, compared to nearly 25,000 in the same month last year. And finally, the research firm Dinata has published data today that shows British workers are ready to embrace working from home in the long run, with 74% of UK respondents stating they want to work from home at least some of the time after the pandemic. Meanwhile, 15% of those surveyed would like to work from home permanently. That's all your Skills World news from fenews.co.uk. Contact us at Skills World Live. Email skillsworld@fenews.co.uk. Follow us on Twitter @Tom Buick, @FENews. Use the hashtag SkillsWorld. Call us on 02032 900 111. That's 02032 900 111.
I saw a light when you passed me
On last night's show, we played 4 completely new tunes from that independent music site of choice, epidemicsound.com. Tonight, we're back playing some of those tracks that are more regularly on the show, like the one you just heard there from Thomas Skiedelberg, and a song called The Reason Why I Shine. And talking of someone that shone like a very bright light indeed when she was Minister of State for Skills and Apprenticeships until July of last year, I'm referring, of course, to Anne Milton, who joins us on the line now. Good evening, Anne.
Good evening, Tom, and what a very kind introduction.
Well, it was heartfelt. No, look, really appreciate you coming on. Given that you only stepped down from ministerial and frontline politics just a few months ago, I mean, what are your reflections on being England's skills minister?
Well, I always said at the time, I thought it was the best job in government, and my view hasn't changed. It's a fantastic role to have the opportunity to do, and particularly for me, because we were right at the start of the new apprenticeship system. So all the decisions had been made as to how it would run, and my job was to get it up and working, actually, for employers and for apprentices, and of course for the training providers.
Yeah, and obviously the Prime Minister felt you were kind of irreplaceable in the sense that initially he thought he could do without a skills and apprenticeship minister, and there was a bit of a hiatus, wasn't it, when we didn't have one, and then now we've got one. So I think you kind of proved the point there, didn't you?
Well, you've got, I mean, there is nothing more important. It's hard to remember, but even before COVID, we had a skills shortage. There's a world skills shortage, actually. So it was pretty urgent before this happened, and it's now very urgent.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, look, in the next segment of the programme, I'll be discussing with sector experts whether the inspection regime for providers should be changed. I just wondered what your views were on Ofsted and whether you think it does need to change or aspects of it need to change.
Well, I think no inspection scheme should be static, because it's got to change and adapt, and particularly now with the changing ways people are delivering learning to people. So I think it's very hard with inspection regimes. What I'd like to see, and I've always wanted to see, is more input from learners.
Yeah,
they know if they're getting good training. They know if they're getting their needs met, their training needs met. And I think more input from them is always valuable and enriches an inspection regime. And also I feel it's quite complex at the moment. It's quite, we've got Ofsted, we've got the Office for Students doing degree level apprenticeships. It's a bit messy, I would say, at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to come on to that actually in a later question, but I also just really wanted to ask you about, first of all, the Department for Education and its relationship with the FE sector. Perhaps you can spill the beans now, you're no longer in government, I don't know. But, including the kind of DfE's relationship with other Whitehall departments like the Treasury. I mean, as Minister, were you wholly satisfied with a culture in sanctuary buildings that sort of many of my colleagues anyway in the sector felt was just a bit too untrusting and top down?
I think, I have to say, I've never worked with such an amazing group of officials, the civil servants. Yeah. And it's important to say, because all the civil servants I work with were not just doing a job. They really believed in further education. I think the trouble is that government is clunky. It's slow. And of course, any government department is always under the thumb of Treasury. So there were lots of things we might have wanted to do, but you've always got to get Treasury agreement to go ahead and do them. And that process can be terribly slow and, as I say, quite clunky. And what we need now, we needed it then, we need it even more so now, is a really agile system that can respond quickly to changes, that doesn't keep people waiting, that doesn't produce pages and pages of documentation that people have to wade through in order to comply. It's important, always important, that government can guarantee that taxpayers' money is being spent wisely. But you can chase down the last degree of assurance and lose a great deal in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, obviously the whole world has changed just in the last few weeks, never mind the last few months until you stood down from frontline politics. But when you kind of look ahead then at some of the challenges for this government, obviously we're going to have an emergency budget now, which Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, has announced. And of course, going into COVID, I think there was a feeling, and again, this is, I think, a great credit to you, to officials at the department, to the AOC, to a whole range of bodies that have been campaigning for, if you like, the investment case for FE, obviously helped by things like the Auger Review to some extent as well.
Yes.
I mean, how likely do you think it will be, given that as a whole nation, we've had to get the credit card out and we've put £300 billion on that card, rightly and necessarily so, obviously, to deal with this public health emergency. But to what extent does that just change potentially the whole terms of the debate, particularly for the department now with the Treasury, about getting that important investment, which I think prior to the crisis, everybody seemed to recognise from top to bottom that it was needed?
It was needed before, and it's needed more now, because the way out of this is to invest in the skills of the population. If you look at adults alone, I mean, the adult education budget is very small by comparison, and it's gone down substantially over the last 10 years. There's a win-win out there for employers and for improving the skills of the population. And it's painful to put more money in when, as you say, the credit card is pretty well maxed out.
Yeah.
But actually, this is the way we come out of this and come out of the recession that we're obviously going to be sitting in. We have to address productivity, and we have to address the skills of the general population. That's school leavers, but right up into the adult sector as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely critical. And what the sector needs from ministers and from the Secretary of State is, what they need is for them to spend some of their political capital really arguing hard for the case to get money in.
Is that the point then? I mean, has Gavin Williamson, the Secretary of State, really got to put his head above the parapet? Because you saw after the financial crash, Anne, that the response to, I mean, obviously, the Conservatives, the coalition won the election in 2010. We had austerity. There was a sense we've got to bring the deficit down, the day-to-day spending. We've got to bring also that as a proportion of national debt. So that was, if you like, the narrative for the last decade. We're in danger, aren't we? We're starting a new decade when we could be all the way back to square one. I mean, do you think on the specific issue of investment in FE that Gavin Williamson really has to say to Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson, look, we cannot go down the road we went down last time, where we effectively cut spending to FE by about 40% on average, and we lost 2.2 million adult learners?
Yeah, and in fact, if you look at the case for education across the board, but that must include further education.
Yeah,
the case is very, very strong. Sir Michael Marmot published a report in January looking at the life expectancy of adults in the different regions. Education correlates probably as closely with health as anything else. So this isn't just a matter of skills and employment and productivity. It's also about improving the health of the nation.
Yeah.
Well-educated people are healthier people. So the case can be made every which way. And yes, absolutely, the Secretary of State and ministers have got to put their head well above the parapet and be making the case. And I know there will be others out there like Robert Halfon who will be making the case as well. Yeah. It's really hard to get traction for further education.
Of course.
And you've got to be very, very loud and very noisy as an advocate for it, because it always gets drowned out. Schools are always clamouring for money. Higher education is always clamouring for money. But actually what we need now is a skilled population.
We do, indeed. And indeed, often even getting the attention of the mainstream media, I think, in the FE and skills sector is one of the reasons why, actually, out of sheer frustration, we set up this programme during COVID-19 because we wanted to make sure that the kind of issues that we're talking about this evening and all our guests have been talking about, actually, they do get a good airing and they're not just superficially brushed over. Let's focus in the time we've got available then just to talk about the Apprenticeship Program, because, again, I mean, it's something that you were a huge champion of when you were in office, and in particular on the whole issue of ensuring quality. I mean, you were very strong actually at the time of pushing back on big structural changes. I think you made that point very, very often, and that was really about the need to ensure that we fine-tune the apprenticeship model, that we try and build a sustainable model in England, not something over successive governments arguably has been a feature. But at the same time, you also knocked some heads together at what is widely seen as the whole mess of having 18 different external quality assurance bodies in apprenticeships.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost like having 18 different Ofsteds that we're talking about tonight. I mean, you push for Ofqual and the Office of Students working with the Institute for Apprenticeships to be the sole sort of statutory agencies responsible. Do you still think that that is the right approach?
Yeah, I think it probably is the right approach. I mean, structural change in government is always terribly wasteful of time.
Yeah.
And you often only get minimal benefit from it. I think my general feeling would be now simplify and rationalise things. Anything you can do to ensure that institutions work closer together will be a good thing. The apprenticeship levy, we were in the process of going through a review when I left office, and of course Augur is sitting there probably gathering dust on the shelves at the moment. So I wouldn't want to see big structural changes because everybody just got used to how we were doing things. But what we mustn't do is to sacrifice quality.
Yeah.
The reason this program was successful is because we were absolutely hardcore on quality, and that must continue in a simplified inspection regime. But as I say, the apprentices themselves are probably the people who are best placed to say, did I get a good training?
Yeah. And as you know,
ask them, use them, because they know if they got a good training. They're the ones spending the time doing these courses, working with the training providers, and they also know which are the good employers, of course, as well. So really, you put the user central to whether they're getting what they need. Make it simple, and it's going to need more money in it. I mean, the apprenticeship system needed more money in it when I left office.
Absolutely. And the National Audit Office, I think, said in one of its reports, I think it was the second report, it said that the apprenticeship standards were costing twice as much to deliver. And that obviously included the endpoint assessment, as if somehow that was a kind of, a pejorative passing of judgment on the programme. Whereas I think for those of us that have been in the sector for many, many years, who've seen some of the what you might sort of describe as quality scandals over the years, thought actually that this was a badge of honour, that the fact that we're actually investing in the standards. We have an endpoint assessment system. You would have met, I'm sure, on your ministerial travels, and many of these apprentices who were so proud of, having to go for this practical observation, having to, then see if they can get a distinction or a merit or an award, again, graded endpoint assessment apprenticeships. I mean, I'm not criticising, obviously, the Institute, who I think have done a brilliant job over the whole period of the crisis to try and grant sort of flexibilities. But do you not think we've got to be very, very careful that we don't almost sort of throw the baby out of the bathwater and expediency becomes the rule of the day? And of course, with the Treasury, as ever, always looking at the pennies that are going out the door on these programmes and things like endpoint assessment, we do need to uphold the investment and indeed the quality in the whole model. Do you not think?
Yeah, well, as I say, mindful of the fact that the government always wants to get good value for taxpayers' money. Sure. You can't get quality on the cheap. It's as simple as that, Tom. The reason it was successful is because the apprenticeships were high quality. It meant something. It was something that an apprentice could trade. They could go to a new employer and say, look, I've got one of these apprenticeships at whatever level, and there was a quality mark on that. Now, sacrifice that at your peril. Yeah. I always used to say this because we were under pressure on numbers, of course. Would we get to the magic 3 million?
Yeah, that's not going to happen, is it?
I mean, I can get you, any government can get you 3 million apprenticeships. The question is whether they're quality apprenticeships, and the quality is absolutely critical. And I know government will be looking to save money, but if they save money on this, it will be a huge mistake.
Yeah.
as you say, there are lots in the sector that have seen disasters in the past, and there are a lot of officials. And, the commitment from officials to this programme was to do with the fact that this, for the first time, was a quality programme.
Yeah, well, let's hold on to that. Final question, and look, I'm bound to ask this of a former government minister. I mean, if you could do the skills job all over again, what would you do differently? And what is the one piece of advice perhaps you would give to any occupant of that particular ministerial brief?
I think that it probably wouldn't have affected me, but the preparation for the new apprenticeships in 2017 wasn't as good as it could have been. I mean, even when I left office, there was still employers who didn't understand the 20% off the job. They still believe that, you had to take one full day a week rather than taking, maybe a couple of hours out each day. So there was poor understanding of the system when it came in. My advice to a new minister is to put your head above the parapet, because if you don't, as a minister, advocate for the FE sector, then who else will?
Indeed, and it is such a long and rocky road to ministerial office, as I'm sure you know well. So it's definitely worth making the best of it when you're there, isn't it?
It's a long and rocky road, Tom, but sometimes you're going to have to break a few eggs if you want to get what you want. So you have to break a few eggs and be pretty hardcore about what you want and make the case for it. Right,
Honourable Anne Milton, former Skills and Apprenticeship Minister. Thank you so much for coming on the show this evening.
It's a pleasure, Tom.
See you soon.
Okay, nice to talk to you.
And you.
You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Buick.
Do you miss me at all? Do you think about the things we used to do? No, you couldn't stand tall. So why didn't you call? So many years has gone by, but I think about you all the time. Looks like you're changing and all, but why didn't you call? Something in the air, always something in the air. Inexplicable, I can feel it in the air. Can you feel me? Can you feel me? Can you feel me? Do you miss me at all? Do you think about the things we used to do? No, you couldn't stand tall. So why didn't you call? So many years has gone by, but I think about you all the time. Looks like you're changing and all, but why didn't you call? Something in the air, always something in the air. Inexplicable, I can feel it in the air. Can you feel me?
song was Can You Feel Me by Love Beans. Now, to kick off tonight's big debate, we're asking the question, do we need to change the inspection regime for schools and FE providers in England? It comes at a time when at the last general election, the Labour Party pledged to abolish Ofsted if they'd won. And it's fair to say passions are stirred right across the entire education and training sector, just at the mere mention of an Ofsted inspection report. Advocates of the external inspection regime point to the need for public performance and accountability. They say that the secret garden of educational achievement is no more because teachers and trainers have to account for their methods to parents and learners, who in turn use the publicly available information to make their own judgments. Meanwhile, the critics of Ofsted, and there are many of them, say the whole judgment-based accountability system needs to change, not least because of the way a poor Ofsted judgment can ruin a teacher's career, or how parents can take flight, causing further financial difficulties for the school, which in turn then makes it difficult to recruit really good teachers. For some critics of the current inspection regime, the 4-point grading system from outstanding to inadequate simply has to go. The boss of Ofsted, Amanda Spielman, has hit back at her critics, saying in her latest annual report launched in January that exam grades are, and I quote, hollow if pupils have not received a well-rounded education, adding that poor children are not helped by turning, and I quote, a blind eye to schools that get good results but offer a narrow curriculum. Joining me now to discuss these issues, and I'm sure much more, is Chris Jones, who was previously HMI Specialist Advisor for Apprenticeships at Ofsted. Good evening, Chris.
Good evening. How are you?
I'm very well. Thanks for joining us. Now, also joining us is Karen Westpeaser, who is the Chief Operating Officer at Teacher Tap, a free continuing professional development app. Good evening, Karen.
Good evening.
Thanks for coming on. Now, Chris, let's come to you first. Tonight's theme is, should the inspection regime for schools and FE providers be changed? Given you recently worked at a senior level for Ofsted, do you think it should be changed?
Well, I think one of the things about Ofsted is that we've always gone through a process of reviewing how we interact with providers. And you know, the new inspection framework, as Amanda quite rightly said, it was a process of evolution and not revolution. Yeah. And what the current regime does, and that was a big change from the previous one, is to concentrate on the curriculum experience for learners of all ages and looking at the quality of what they receive and the progress that those individuals make, rather than the simple process of bean counting and determining a provider's success or otherwise based on the number of qualifications or the point scores that learners achieve while they're with them. So in a sense, so I think the education inspection framework was a really positive move away from the very data-driven approaches that existed before.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, isn't it? It's like every framework that you introduce, there's always a bit of a backlash about it, and there's over time, critics have their say about it, and then you change the framework and often try and accommodate some of these criticisms, and then you still get lots of criticism, it seems.
Yeah, but I mean, a lot of that, in a sense, is about people's perceptions of external scrutiny and the worry. And, I do understand the concern that any provider has about the sort of the inspection regime and the use that other organisations or other people make of the outcomes of those inspections. Ofsted make the judgment and publish the report. It's other organisations that actually determine the outcomes for the providers.
Yes, indeed. Karen, I'll put the same question to you. Do you think the inspection regime should be changed?
At the risk of sounding a bit too reasonable and agreeable, I think probably it shouldn't change at this particular point.
Why is that?
The new framework that has come in has whilst it has been an evolution, I think it has been quite a step change in terms of evolution. And I think it's made a lot of providers think about things, in particular their curriculum, differently. And I think that needs time to bed in. I think the reality, whilst many people might call for changes in Ofsted and in inspections, is that if it were changed in the next academic year, say, there would be an outcry against that. That wouldn't make sense either.
Okay.
So it's about giving it time to bed in. However, I think what does need to happen alongside that is more data to be gathered, both about the impact that inspections are having on providers and the staff that work in them, but also on the learners and the communities where these providers are working as well. So making sure that we really know how well these inspections are working for the people that it's really trying to serve.
Yeah, we're just talking about the impact for a moment on head teachers and our educational leaders of schools, and indeed training providers. I think it's always important on a show like Skills World Live to stress that it's not just the school system, of course, that's subject to Ofsted inspection. It is also FE and the apprenticeship system as well. But to what extent do you agree or indeed disagree with Ross McCullen, who is the executive principal at the Midlands Academies Trust, who wrote in a blog not too long ago? She said that the real issue with Ofsted, and I quote, is to get rid of the high-stakes nature by removing the ridiculous 4-point scale for judgments, because that, she said, is the real problem. Do you agree with that, Chris? Chris, you still there?
I am still there. I'm thinking about it. I think it
4-point system.
How you define the problem.
Well, she's defining it as essentially the fact you've got in these reports, when you issue them, outstanding, good, requires improvement, which in the old days used to be called satisfactory, and of course inadequate. And inadequate obviously often results in either funding being withdrawn if you're a private training provider, if you're a school or you're in the public sector, it can result in people losing their jobs. So that's one executive principal's view of the current approach. She thinks it should just be removed.
Now that I've left, I mean, sort of one of the things that I was always concerned about was the exemption for outstanding providers.
Right.
For the exemption from inspection. I always felt in my heart that was the wrong decision.
And was that where people could go years, or schools or training providers could go years without an inspection if they'd already bagged an outstanding?
So I think that what that leads to, in a sense, is the danger of complacency. And in a sense, I personally not too bothered about any grading scale, as long as it calls out weaknesses when they exist. Because one of the things we've got to recognise is that poor quality teaching and learning leads to poor outcomes for learners and has a lifelong impact on those learners who've participated in poor quality learning. And in a sense, that's the moral responsibility for Ofsted in supporting and calling out poor provision. Because it's not about the provider under those circumstances. It is about the learners who are at the receiving end of poor quality provision.
Okay.
So whether it was a 2-point scale of good or not good enough, it wouldn't personally bother me either way, but I think we do need to have a system where we can praise and recognise good quality learning and teaching and excellent quality learning and teaching.
Well, I think everybody would agree with that, wouldn't they? I mean, we all, I mean, I think you wouldn't find anyone disagree with the idea of excellence in teaching and learning. I mean, Karen, do you not think the counter-argument to head teachers like Ross McCullen is from more a parental perspective? I mean, without something like the 4-point scale, without, for example, if you move house and you're looking for a primary school or a secondary school, or maybe it's for a grown-up adult, young adult who's trying to find an apprenticeship or an FE college, these Ofsted reports really do demystify in many ways, a lot of the, and I see this in obviously the sector I operate, but there's a lot of jargon that gets spoken. And actually this simple 4-point measure, okay, it's got issues with it, but it actually signals very clearly to parents what good looks like.
Yeah, I would agree actually that would be the counter argument. And we do know from Ofsted's own data that 9 out of 10 parents know the rating that their school received in their last inspection, and 8 out of 10 say that they read the report in full. That doesn't mean, of course, that they find the reports useful. Parentkind did a survey recently, and they found that only 4% of parents think that the Ofsted reports tell them everything that they need to know about a school. I did say school 3 times in that answer.
No, it's fine.
And that comes back to my original point, though.
Yeah.
Well, because that data, that surveying is done about schools and school parents. And so the point I was making earlier is that we do need to have a lot more information for the FE and the provider sector about what the users of the Ofsted reports are actually thinking. I don't think that actually exists at the moment. I'd be happy if Chris were able to contradict me.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's throw that question back to Chris. I mean, he didn't leave the Ofsted service that long ago, and indeed he is a specialist and an expert in the whole work-based and apprenticeship area. Chris, why aren't we collecting the right data from Karen's perspective then on the learner voice?
I think we are, but obviously one of the things that we've got to recognise is that the school sector is very, very much larger than the FE sector in relation to the number of providers that Ofsted interacts with. So obviously when Ofsted talks about data, more often than not, they will talk about schools when they actually mean the whole range of provision that we inspect. And schools is often used as a shorthand rather than encompassing the whole range of everything that we look at. We do have the data about sort of further education providers and the use that people make of reports. And in a sense, we've always, as an organisation, had the holy grail of all users of education and training providers reading the report and making the report more user-friendly.
Yeah.
But if I'm honest, most times in further education, when anybody reads a report, it's not likely to be parents because the learners are older.
Yeah.
It may well be the learners themselves, but largely it was the people who read the report in the past were the provider themselves who've been inspected, any of their competitors, and the trade press, like FE News and FE Week, who read the reports and report on and talk about them. So in a sense, the readership was limited. And I also think that one of the outcomes of the new education inspection is the shorter, more user-friendly, more learner-friendly, more parent-friendly report that actually says what it's like to be a learner, rather than saying what it's like to be a leader or manager.
Yeah. So, I mean, just on that new inspection framework, because obviously I think that was reading between the lines what Amanda Spielman was trying to say about the move away, as she might see it, from schools operating like exam factories. But equally, she talked in her annual report about even now with the new framework, you've got essentially providers, across the whole system, gaming the system as well and gaming the framework. I mean, it probably happens in all public policy frameworks, but is that a particular problem, do you think, Karen, for the Ofsted model?
I'm very interested in the new framework, and I had a look at the data that was published for the inspections that have taken place with the providers under the new framework. And it's quite interesting from a data perspective because of the number of new providers, the number that haven't had that prior Ofsted inspection to kind of know where they're moving to. Yeah. So by my count, there were, under the published data, 82 inspections under the new framework so far. And around half of those hadn't been inspected before. So they're coming in fresh. But then what's interesting is that they're not coming in fresh and really strong, that there are weaknesses in the system that are being highlighted by this. So only half of those, so a quarter overall, are good. And they're coming into the RI category and the inadequate category, which I think is really quite problematic. Where I don't know, and what data doesn't tell you, was whether that's a problem with the framework itself.
Yeah.
And I know some providers do have issues with the new framework and feeling that having a framework that works across the whole of FE is missing some nuance from some parts of the sector. Or is it a problem that's being identified within the sector and with some of the providers?
Sure.
I think it's probably a little bit of both.
A little bit of both. Chris, final word for you, because we're running out of time. I mean, you probably would have picked up in the press now, because you're no longer with Ofsted, that there's a plan, and it sounds very sensible, to look at the quality, if you like, of online learning, given how important that's been, obviously, during COVID-19. I mean, schools have always engaged in some kind of digital online learning, but that's really been stepped up in the last 10 to 12 weeks. Presumably, you could imagine the framework changing again in future to take account of the quality of digital delivery.
Yeah, I think it may well do. I mean, online learning, blended learning has been around for a while.
It sure has, yeah.
COVID-19 and furloughing and social distancing and closing centres has had an impact and raised the profile of online learning more. In many respects, learning is learning. And as long as students, apprentices, pupils, learners have had the opportunity to develop and grow their knowledge, apply that as understanding, and test out whether or not that learning is secure, as long as the processes around that are still there, then whether it's online or face-to-face shouldn't, in a sense, make a difference. But I think one of the things that we'll probably look towards in the next few months is how providers are, in a sense, recalibrating the different experiences that learners will have had over this period of absence.
Okay.
And we've got to bear in mind that for schools, that's actually included 2 holiday periods.
Yeah, sure.
So actually the amount of time away from learning isn't as extensive as perhaps it may have been. But I think there's an opportunity for recalibration, perhaps for rebaselining where learners are, for looking at the gaps and planning how we can fill those gaps. In apprenticeships, for example, we may well have...
Chris, alas, we're running out of time in this segment, so let's end the discussion on your point about recalibration. Chris Jones, previously HMI Specialist Advisor for Apprenticeships at Ofsted, and Karen Westpeaser, Chief Operating Officer at Teacher Tap. Thanks to you so much for taking time out in your evenings to be with us this evening.
Thank you.
You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Buick.
And up in the clouds, but I've always felt that something's missing. That was until I found you right there in the crowd. You came into my life and started a fire. You made me feel like I could touch the sky. Oh, there's nothing missing now that you're my desire. Now all I have to do is to make you mine. 'Cause I know, and you know what we could be. baby, here in my heart. When I'm with you, I feel so much better. Oh, yeah. Before you, I was just a shell, so stuck in the dark. You came into my life and started a fire. You made me feel like I could touch the sky. Oh, there's nothing missing now that you're my desire. Now all I have to do is to make you mine. 'Cause I know, and you know what we could be. Like a song, like a perfect melody. Baby, don't say you don't believe in me. 'Cause you know, and I know, we're onto something good. You know, and I know, we got something good. Follow your heart, baby, don't be shy. Just follow yours and I'll follow mine. 'Cause I know, and you know what we could be. Like a song, like a perfect melody. Baby, don't say you don't believe in me. 'Cause you know, and I know, we're onto something good. You know, and I know, we got something good. Something good.
Something good. And that's Velveteen with Emmy. At the top of the show, I mentioned that one of my last physical engagements I actually been able to get out of my house here in Sussex was up in London, Mayfair to be precise, at the wonderful centenary celebrations of the Institute for the Motor Industry, hosted by none other than Prince Michael of Kent. And also that evening, as well as fulfilling his Chief Executive Officer duties, he was also doing a bit of what I'm doing now, the presenter impresario, and was interviewing Ed Balls, no less. Anyway, we're joined on the line now by Steve Nash, who's the Chief Executive Officer at the IMI. Good evening, Steve.
Good evening.
Yeah, thanks for helping me close the show. Have you enjoyed this evening's conversations and discussions?
Yeah, I have actually. I particularly enjoyed listening. I enjoyed it all, but I particularly enjoyed listening to Anne Milton. Actually, I thought she had a lot of sensible things to say and some good advice for her successor.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, always a difficult one, that, isn't it?
Yeah.
But just a quick take then on tonight's big debate theme, which has been about changing the inspection regime for providers. What's your view then of Ofsted? I mean, would you change it or lose it?
I wouldn't change it right now. I mean, look. There's never going to be a perfect system that everybody loves, is there? You know, I mean, in the past, I mean, I've had academies reporting to me that these are training academies, not school academies, that had to, you know, that were inspected by Ofsted. It's always stressful for the people involved, but you know, you have to have some kind of measure of delivery, don't you? And you know, it's not a perfect system, but it's not entirely broken either. So I'm generally of the view that right now I wouldn't push for a wholesale change.
No, and as you say, there's always going to be that clamour and that demand for some kind of public accountability framework, because obviously billions of pounds get spent on it. So.
Yeah, and I think when it comes down to individuals, you know, teachers being judged and so on. I mean, I can understand it. You know, as was mentioned, I mean that can cost someone their career pretty much, can't it?
Yeah, indeed.
But you know, again, you do need to know where that money's going and that you're getting value for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I really got on the show to talk about apprenticeships. Many car dealerships, of course, as you are well known, have just starting to emerge from lockdown. I'm sure this has meant a very difficult time for apprenticeships in your industry. Now, you've written to the current minister, Gillian Keegan, haven't you, about apprenticeships, in particular about the levy?
Yes, I have. You know, I mean, look, apprenticeships are part of the fabric of our industry. So, you know, we never, we haven't revisited apprenticeships. They've always been there. They've been the time-honoured entry route into our industry. And, we, along with many other people and across many sectors, have worked really, really hard to deliver the agenda that successive, from the as you said earlier on, from the coalition government forward, has been a central plank of their agenda around apprenticeships.
Yeah.
And it hasn't been easy. I mean, as Anne Milton quite rightly admitted, it didn't all go swimmingly early on.
No.
It was difficult to engage employers at first. We saw a fairly big step backwards from the old framework apprenticeships into standards. But, we've been working really hard at that, and we've been making very good progress, getting the numbers back to the sort of numbers we were used to seeing before the levy, before the standards were introduced. Very much behind them. But COVID-19 has driven a coach and horses.
Well, they've fallen off a cliff, haven't they? I mean, only 7,000 starts in April. That's across the whole sector.
The letter I wrote to Gillian Keegan was in response to consultation with our biggest employers.
Right.
And I know it's not all about levy payers, and I understand that. I mean, there are, but I mean, these are the guys in terms of delivering. In terms of engagement, if these people don't engage, we really are in trouble, because the whole fabric of the system that has been set up. I mean, automotive is not unique, but it's relatively unusual in that delivering automotive apprenticeships is quite a costly thing. It's quite
they're very prestigious as well. If you can get
equipment heavy, space and capital equipment heavy. So, if you don't get the numbers through, it's difficult to sustain that. And when you've got, your largest employers saying, with only 9% of them saying that they think that their plans would be unchanged for this year. And I mean, I'd already seen some research from the Federation of Industry Sector Skills and Standards, FIS, that said that they reckon that there would be a cumulative loss of about 120,000 apprenticeships. And
well, we had them on the show, actually.
30% fall on numbers this year, and that was pretty much reflected by our employers, with a number of them saying they were not going to, quite a large number of them saying they wouldn't recruit anybody this year. So, and actually it was their request. They actually said to me, look, in practical terms, if bear in mind that I mean, they've got a lot of other pressures facing them, and they, as you rightly said, they started back in business yesterday in earnest, but they've got a massive amount of catching up to do.
They've got a lot on their plate.
And it's blown a huge hole in their finances. For them, having the levy money, allowing the levy money to accumulate would give the HR directors a strong case for saying we still need to recruit. I
mean, look, we've only got sort of 20 seconds left, and I've got to close the show as well. But I mean, your central proposal, I'm right, Anna, Steve, that essentially you're asking the Minister to extend, or indeed the Treasury to extend, this 24-month period where it's a sort of use or lose it, isn't it? If you're a levy-paying employer and you've got a digital account, I mean, is that basically what you're asking for?
Yeah, we're basically saying give those employers a break for 2 years, for up to 2 years. Allow them to accumulate those funds, and they will reinvest them in apprenticeships. Otherwise, the likelihood is we're going to see a catastrophic drop-off in numbers.
Yeah. Well, look, given the lost months, I should say, due to the lockdown and the pandemic, I mean, surely some sort of extension has got to be in the offing. Steve Nash, Chief Executive Officer of the IMI, thanks so much for coming on the show this evening.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Buick.
We've come to the end of another informative and interesting show. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. Don't forget to tell your friends to listen in too. We're available on all the popular podcasting sites, and of course at fenews.co.uk/skillsworld. Do join us for tomorrow's episode 27, when we will be going international again, when all our guests will be from overseas, including the head of the Global Apprenticeship Network based in Geneva, Switzerland. Thanks to Gavin O'Mara and our digital producer, Ellie Hansen, who are both Ofsted outstanding in every sense of the term. Skills World Live is an FE News production supported by the Federation of Awarding Bodies Platinum Partners Programme. I'm going to play out now with this track by Alex Dovo, Makes Me Feel. See ya.
Subscribe to Skills World Live at fenews.co.uk/skillsworld.